Okay. So, I want to talk a little bit about history to start with. Have you ever wondered where history comes from? Where do we get this thing that we call history? Now, some people might say, milk comes from the grocery store, and other people would say history comes from history textbooks or from other history books. And those answers, of course, are right in a certain way, but in other ways, they're simplistic and incomplete. So I usually tell my students that history is a two-part process. The first step is to gather information, particularly from old artifacts, but especially from old documents. So historians love documents. We love books, we love diaries, chronicles, letters, archives, you name it. And the second part of history is to gather those facts and put some kind of interpretation on it. And that's what you find in a history book. So historians organize a narrative. It's like a story almost to communicate what happened in the past based on the documents they have at hand and to explain why they think it happened the way that it did. So if you think about history that way, as someone's interpretation of what happened, you can understand why there are so many arguments about history. Who gets to tell the story? The slave owner's descendants or the descendants of slaves? The pioneer and the settler or the Native American? Is the Mennonite story best told by the 16th century Catholic inquisitor, the magistrate who ordered the execution, the Lutheran or Catholic historian following the religious traditions into the present day? Or should Mennonite history be told by Anabaptist believers or Mennonite historians? So now it is easier to see why someone is always willing to look at any historical event and say, think of the Holocaust, for example, that didn't really happen that way, didn't happen at all. It's just some biased historian's interpretation. So some historians have thought about how to counter such dismissals of the past. And one cornerstone that has emerged is memory. And we heard a little bit about that already in the children's story. So here's an example about how that might work. Some people might think it would be a terrible violation to have a random person listen into your phone conversation without permission, and that such a thing could never happen legally in the United States. I could probably get most people under 50 to agree that such a thing has never legally happened. But some of you have different memories that would prevent me from convincing you that no one has ever listened into your phone conversation without permission. And you would tell me about all the people on your party telephone line back in the day. Kids after church go home and ask your grandparents about what kind of wild parties they were throwing on those telephone lines. They were out of control. This is a memory that has become a part of history without being in most textbooks. So what we have seen and heard becomes part of our memory, our own personal version of history that's beyond interpretation, and it proves the reality of history. And what we tell others from our memories becomes a part of their memory and their history. Memory, and in this sense, history, is something we do together as a community. Memory is one foundation stone of history and tradition, and ultimately of how we as humans make sense of our world and discover truth. And Jesus, I think, knew that and used that. Let's think about what Jesus said at the Last Supper in the version recorded by Luke. He took up the cup and then the bread to share with the disciples. About the bread, he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." Paul in 1 Corinthians reported, as we have heard, that Jesus used this phrase about both the cup and the bread. Like a good history teacher, Jesus urges us to remember this event, this history. In addition to focusing on that one event, however, there were important additional layers of meaning at work, as there always are in history. Recall the setting in which Jesus said these words and took these actions with the cup and the bread at the Last Supper. Jesus knew, of course, that this would be his last meal, but the disciples did not seem to understand this. As the beginning of this passage in Luke makes clear, they all thought they were celebrating the Jewish festival of Passover. Only later did the Christian community take to calling this modified version of Passover the Last Supper and commemorate it as communion. Now, once we know that Jesus began this ceremony with a declaration that he was eager to eat Passover with his disciples, we are on to the next level of history. Passover itself was a meal instituted as part of the liberation of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, as part of the final plague and judgment on an oppressive government, as we heard in the passage from Exodus. Yet, even while giving instructions on how to stay safe during a plague that could kill you, the instructions in verse 14 included how to remember this day in the future. This day shall be a day of remembrance for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. Throughout your generations, you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance. Here we read again the importance of memory. This memory was something public, recurring, and something that happened in community, a community that was being built in part by the historical events themselves. Jesus invoking the Passover puts a layer of history onto the meal he shared with his disciples and asked them to remember. They too knew this history and were invited to see themselves participating in and reshaping the meaning of an event that was something like 1,200 years in their past. By setting his Last Supper during the Passover meal, Jesus used history to collapse the centuries and to make linkages for his students between their present situation and an ancient example of God's power and faithfulness. It's a powerful teaching example. But for that linkage to work, his students had to know the history. History in this way becomes a set of layers or lenses that we can lay down over the top of our picture of the present to orient us to where we are, like the different layers of a Google map showing us different views and nearby available options. Once the disciples started to peel back the years and add the layers in their mind, since they knew the history, they could go back additional centuries, for example, to when the family of Jacob, also called Israel, went down to Egypt in the first place, or to the story in Genesis 28 of Jacob finding a place to spend the night, sleeping on a rock for a pillow, and then having a vision of a ladder into heaven and God promising him that his descendants would bless all the families of the earth. In the morning, Jacob called that place Beth El, the house of God. If you know this history, think of all the layers of events, all the layers of God's faithfulness that were evoked that night when Jesus reenacted the history of the Passover. But if you don't know the history, that Last Supper was just a bunch of guys talking about weird stuff while they ate a sparse meal. So Jesus, the history teacher, connected his students to their past at that meal 2,000 years ago, and likewise set a trajectory for those students to teach their students about that meal in the future. Do this in remembrance of me. Jesus had a history lesson plan that worked and is still being taught every time we celebrate communion. The Old Testament was, among other things, the history textbook that Jesus and his students would have used back then. What layers of history might we add to help us understand where we are today as we worship at Glennon Heights Mennonite Church? Let me tell three stories that might provide good layers of orientation that were recorded for Mennonite history since the Last Supper, when Jesus instructed his followers to think about memory and history as they remembered and followed him. The first story happened in April of 1573 and concerns a woman named Mayakin Wens, who was arrested in Antwerp, Belgium, on suspicion of being an Anabaptist, the group from which Mennonites originated. After attempts by persuasion and torture failed to convince her to deny her beliefs, she was sentenced to death on October 5 and burned at the stake the next day. Mayakin wrote several letters from prison. One of them is preserved to this day in the Mennonite Archive in Amsterdam. Among other things, she wrote this line to her oldest son, a 15-year-old boy named Adrian. Oh, regard not the great multitude, but look at the little flock, which is persecuted for the word of the Lord. For the good persecute none, but are persecuted. Write me a letter as to what your heart says, whether you desire to fear the Lord. This I should like to know. But you must write it better than the last two letters were written. The one which Mayakin Wills brought, however, was good. Mayakin could have lived to see her children grow up if she had recanted her beliefs, but she chose not to. She hoped, of course, that her children would follow in her faith, but she knew that might not happen. She also hoped Adrian would do better in his writing. So, being a mom who encourages and admonishes her children also did not go away just because she was on death row. This story and many more are in a book called The Martyr's Mirrors. And might be it's in your church library or somebody in your church has a copy. You should ask for it and read some of these stories and look for Mayakin's story. The account of her death in this book was written several decades later, and it noted that by then several of her grandchildren were named for her. Years ago, I had a student named Mayakin in one of my classes. Her parents had read this story and named their daughter for this faithful witness to the power of God. Now that you know this history, think of all the layers that were present in the name of one student at Bethel College. They stretch back to 16th century Antwerp, to Jesus' call to remember him at his Last Supper, to the liberation of slaves in Egypt. But if you don't know the history, Mayakin is just an unusual name for a girl. A second set of events, 150 years later, dealt with Lutherans who joined the Mennonite congregation in the Duchy of Prussia, later known as East Prussia, and today part of Russia. On the night of September 4, 1723, soldiers raided the Mennonite settlement in the Tilsit lowlands along the Memel River. The soldiers were looking for especially tall men to serve in the King of Prussia's Potsdam Guards. These were known as tall lads, and they were all significantly taller than average. A great deal of violence was used in the process of kidnapping recruits. About a half dozen men were taken. They were held 3 days in prison in Königsberg without food and water in an unsuccessful attempt to force them to accept military service. They were then reportedly sent on to the king in Potsdam near Berlin for a personal inspection. One man apparently accepted military service while all the others refused and were eventually released following the strenuous efforts by the Mennonite congregational leadership. These men had been singled out because they were recent converts who had joined the Mennonite church. The special laws of Prussia that dealt with Mennonites at that time allowed for those who were born into Mennonite families to avoid military service, but it made conversions illegal, at least in the sense that those who were born into Lutheran or Catholic families were required to serve in the military no matter what. The upshot was that the king declared about Mennonites, I cannot abide such useless worms that refuse to become soldiers. and he expelled the whole lot back to Poland, where they had recently come from. If they would have agreed to recant their beliefs, of course, they could have stayed. But they chose not to, with one noted exception. And the new and the original members of the settlement together created a new congregation that settled back in Poland. If you know the history, you can see how original and new members can build a strong congregation together around faith in Jesus. If you don't care about the history, it's simply a confusing story about stupidly stubborn people in a place you have never heard of. Finally, I want to relate an example that deals directly with Jesus' command to remember his life and teachings in communion. Here is a story I discovered from 150 years ago when I was doing research in the archives in Berlin. It concerns the Heubuden Mennonite Church near Marienburg, Germany. Today it's Malbork in Poland. And it was around the time in the 1870s of migrations from Russia and Prussia to the Great Plains by Mennonites who were seeking to avoid military service. The German government at that time had just implemented the draft, ruled out any exemptions for Mennonites, and Mennonites there were not sure what to do next. A small group wanted to serve in the military because they thought that provided for the justified self-defense of the country. A small group opposed any compromise, as they understood refusing military service to be what Jesus taught with his command to love our enemies, and from their own history. The majority were not sure what to do, and they hoped the conflict would simply go away. Gerhard Penner was the elder of the Heubuden congregation, the leader, and later he organized the migration to Beatrice, Nebraska, while others from that congregation went to Whitewater and Elbing, Kansas, and founded churches there. Penner, along with most of the leadership of his congregation, belonged to the group who opposed accepting military service. But other families in his church felt differently. On June 7, 1874, Bernhard Fieguth, a young man from the congregation, appeared at church on a communion Sunday. Fieguth had joined the army in 1873 and been excommunicated for this transgression. Fieguth's father had been bragging in the village this previous week that Penner was going to have to give his son communion or pay a fine or go to jail because there was a new law in Prussia, actually aimed at Catholic priests, that made it illegal for a minister to refuse communion to a member over something that the law required them to do. Elder Penner had a son named Heinrich who met Fieguth at the church door and asked him if he was really going to try and take communion. Fieguth told him he was going to find out if Penner would serve him communion or not. Elder Penner refused him. A week later, the county prosecutor filed charges against Elder Penner. The Marienburg County Court on September 1st, 1874, sentenced Penner to pay a fine or serve a week in jail. Penner claimed that Fieguth's agreement to serve in the military had been a decision to end his membership in the Mennonite Church. Therefore, he had refused to serve communion to Fieguth as a non-member, not as a soldier. Because Fieguth had joined the army in accordance with the law on military service, and there was this new law that prohibited excommunication of church members for obeying a law, the court ruled that Fieguth could not be banned for becoming a soldier. To the government, he was therefore still a member of the Heubuden Church when Penner illegally refused him communion. In upholding Penner's conviction on appeal in 1875, the High Court in Berlin concluded that as long as Mennonites lived in Germany, they would have to obey the May 13 law and adjust their traditional beliefs. Since in the perspective of those who were immigrating to the United States, there were only former Mennonites who were now soldiers, but no real Mennonites left in Germany, they brought the entire Heubuden communion set with them and used it in Beatrice. In the late 1950s, when the church switched to individual cups, they sent the old communion set with large communion cups to Coffin Museum at Bethel College, where today it is part of the permanent exhibit. I have often wondered if Elder Penner was too harsh in his treatment of a brash young man, and such conflict is in any case not pleasant to think about, but it is certainly everywhere in history. The large group of Mennonites who avoided conflict in the 1870s and chose to wait and see what would happen found their descendants serving in the German army during World War I and in World War II, when a significant portion even became members of the Nazi Party. Those who stayed in Russia suffered terribly under Soviet communism. So maybe those of us with immigrant backgrounds should be grateful in hindsight to the conflicts provoked over military service that brought our ancestors to these shores. And now we have another layer of history to place over our thinking about the importance of communion and of sticking together as a community in following Jesus, no matter what society around us suggests we should be doing. Let us therefore resolve to build up the knowledge commended to us by our Lord Jesus as we remember him, so that we can provide layers of interpretation that point to Jesus, the rock of our salvation. We might pay attention, as Brenda did, in pointing out that the hymn lyrics, "And we are people of God's peace," were written by Menno Simons. We might seek out stories of God's faithfulness in the lives of our parents and our grandparents and our fellow church members, so that we have those layers of interpretation to orient us in a confusing and lost world. We might need to read our Bibles more and view Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok less, so that we so that we learn and live into the history of God's love for us. Let us remember every day that we are a part of the web of God's faithfulness that extends across all of time and space. The web extends to Germany, to Poland, to Mayakan Wens in Antwerp, to the exodus of slaves from Egypt, and to Jacob sleeping with a rock for a pillow before hearing the call of God. This web connects all of us to Jesus, our Redeemer, our Savior, and our history teacher. Let us remember. Amen.